Колеги, доброго дня.
Dear colleagues,
Good afternoon. The UCMC is starting its work, and the topic of the first press conference is the National Guard of Ukraine continues to lead in the transition to NATO standards. Our speakers are Kostyantyn Parshin from the Department of Strategic Planning and Interoperability with NATO's military structures, as well as Georgi Kalantadze, military expert who provides assistance to 8 National Guard servicemen, and David Makishvili, who also military experts. Kostyantyn, you are the first one. Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity. We would like to say that to inform that the commandership of the National Guard of Ukraine made the decision on the complete reform of the whole structure of the National Guard. That is the first paramilitary structure which will be reformed completely and will be operating in accordance to the law on the National Guard of Ukraine. The National Guard was one of the first law enforcement agencies that was involved into the activities related to the aggression at our country, and it still continues to participate in all military actions, not just on at the second line, but at the first line of defense, and it participates in the most active military actions. You've all heard and you know that the enemy is applying the hybrid war tactics, which also involves the destabilization of the situation inside the country, and the role of the National Guard is of great importance here. It is very important that the National Guard acts skillfully in the zone of the responsibility at the contact line, and so that it coordinates its actions inside the country, not to give the chance for the enemy to destabilize the situation inside the country, in the cities and in the capital of our country. The National Guard has approached the issue of implementing reform quite systemically. We started from reforming the main department. We all understand that this vertically integrated structure, without the change of control bodies, it will be impossible to reform the whole structure. That is why, to implement the reform, the leadership of the National Guard organized a Department of Strategic Planning, which we all represent here. We invited the foreign specialists into that department, who, as part of the international project Patriot, have been participating in ATO. They were helping in training the armed forces servicemen, the Ministry of the Interior servicemen at the ATO zone, and also in the training centers. The leading specialists of this group are David Makishvili, who headed in Georgia the Forces of Special Operations, Kikabidze Mirab, who was heading the Border Service of Georgia, was the leading specialist and the head of that team is the Brigade General Kalantadze. He was implementing reform in Georgian army for more than 5 years. And this huge experience could now be used and is used by the National Guard of Ukraine. Also, we have organized an extensive international cooperation with different international missions, including with the American military agency, the military attaché also participates very actively in implementing this reform. The whole reform is divided into 3 stages. The first stage is changing the structure of management in accordance to NATO standards. It starts from reforming the main department, then the territorial departments of the National Guard, and then there will be structural changes made in the units which are part of the National Guard. That is done so that the process of setting tasks, of planning, of decision-making is very efficient, and so that the latest international best practices could be applied. This reform is not just cutting down the number of personnel, but it's creating the maximum effective managerial body. The second stage of reform is creating a new system of training the personnel, starting from individual training and down to training the officers of all the levels, of all levels of managerial units. Again, taking into account all the best practices of NATO countries and the experience of the National Guard and all our law enforcement agencies. Also, this stage includes the creation of one of the most efficient institution, the institution of sergeants, which will allow the commandership to efficiently manage and control the actions of their subordinates. This it is the sergeant institution is a body which is very well prepared and will pass all the decisions to the staff. The third task of the reform is maximum interoperability of the National Guard and all other law enforcement agencies, all law enforcement units which participate today in ATO, as well as with the NATO forces. We've seen how the National Guard participated in the exercise, international exercise. So the importance of this interoperability is very, very important. Also, implementing the reform will allow the National Guard to take the place according to the law of Ukraine, which will allow to avoid mistakes which could lead to losses because of training and modern planning. An important result of the reform will be saving forces and money because of good planning of tasks. The Ministry of the Interior continues to be the leader in implementing the reform in law enforcement agencies, which are part of the security system of Ukraine. And the Chief Commander Balan set a deadline for reform. The first stage will be finished within 2 months. The second stage will be finished within 4 months. During this time, the new system of training will be implemented for all the staff of the National Guard, including the officers and commanders. And so now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Brigade General Kalangadze. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Kostyantyn. Let me ask a question. What is your forecast when the entire reforming process could be finished in 6 months, in 8 months, within a year? And the second question, what is the pace of reform in other law enforcement agencies of Ukraine? The full implementation of reform will happen within 6 months. The deadline is very strict, and the reforming process in different directions will go in parallel. Also, we plan to engage international assistance. That's why we hope that the entire reform will be finished within 6 months, and later, within next 2 months, upon completion of the reform, we will begin training, special training for the staff. That's why we expect within the next 6 months to build up the backbone of the new structure. As for the other agencies belonging to the law enforcement sector, of course, the reform there is very much needed. That is what we keep hearing from everybody. The National Guard had approached to this issue from professional point of view, and now it is beginning its reforming process from the management, from the top issue. And then I believe that the law enforcement process will be launched in other enforcement agencies. Thank you. Good afternoon. I will speak about specific reform of education in the National Guard of Ukraine based on the new structure to be built in course of reform. We are going to create new G7 department, which will be responsible for education and training. This is one of the major aspects of the ongoing reform. We clearly observe that the reform is that the current war is asymmetrical, is a so-called hybrid war, which means that we have changed our approach to training and education. We have already started to implement some elements of this project in Zolochev Training Center, where we train experts who already participated in the ATO operations. We also supplemented with our past experience from the Afghan wars, from the Georgia wars, from Israeli wars. Recently, we have made decision with the commandership to form one unit of instructors from the former Patriot unit, and invite several new instructors from the United States, and this will be the base for the framework for the bigger project, supplying trainers able to offer new approach in military training. As for the educational department or training department, it will change the military statutes based on the new developments. General Balan has established that the staff has to be trained in foreign languages too, specifically in English. And there will be officers who will receive this foreign language training first. Later, they will be trained in the United States, in other military aspects, and this would allow us to create new approach to the entire course of training. So the first stage will be preparation of trainers, the second will be preparation of specialists, and the third stage will be training of officers. And this is the best experience in the sequence of stages of military training. This will allow us to gain better understanding with our foreign colleagues from the West. This will allow us to interoperate with our Western colleagues better in course of all sorts of military trainings. And my colleague David Makishvili participated in Iraqi, in Israeli military operations. He is very experienced expert, and he will add a couple of words why we need this type of trainings.
My colleagues have already mentioned that NATO standards, moving to NATO standards of the National Guard, is what we need now, because it will help us together with the NATO countries which participate in military actions and in peacekeeping missions in different countries of the world to speak the same language, including the same language inside the state. Based on the situation which we have in Ukraine, and I spent a year in ATO zone. I saw many problems there. I saw how different military agencies were interacting. Moving to NATO standards is a common language in management and in military operations of NATO countries. And after the reform, this will include also the National Guard of Ukraine. Participating in different military missions, I can give you an example of Afghanistan, where different countries participate in USAF mission. We were all speaking the same language. The headquarters of Americans that were planning the operation would issue an order to any NATO country that participates in military actions, and they conduct military actions, they execute the order, because they have one common understanding or one common NATO standard. Sooner or later, Ukraine will also have to participate in different missions, because we are moving towards Europe, And without law enforcement bodies, it will be difficult to interact with Europe. We will have to participate in different missions. And if we don't have NATO standards, it will be very difficult for us to interact with military units, which will, together with Ukrainian troops or Ukrainian National Guard, which will be together with them executing different tasks in different countries. Thank you. Any questions to our speakers, to David, to other participants? I will have a question to Georgi. Georgi, could you please come up to the stage again? Are there some specific units of the National Guard which have already implemented or which are in the process of implementation of the reforms? 3 days ago, we were present at the training of a new brigade. The brigade showed the headquarters, how we saw it in Afghanistan, in Iraq, but we need to apply systematic approach. We need to implement such a reform that in all headquarters there are similar departments and sectors. So they have formed the brigade of the National Guard according to NATO standards, but we need a systemic approach. We need to do that for all, not for just some brigades. Thank you, Georgi. Any other questions, dear colleagues? Once there are no questions, thank you, David, Georgi, and Konstantin.